All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our first in our webinar series by the Environmental Professional Programs in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. We're kicking off this webinar series with a big look at conservation with Nathan Schulfer. And the following webinars will focus more on some of the professional aspects of conservation and why one might want to do a graduate degree in environmental conservation or environmental observation and informatics. These sessions will be recorded and posted online for you to view later. And we welcome comments and questions throughout the webinar. So if you do have a question or a comment, feel free to use the Q&A option in the chat, and we'll address it either as it comes in or at the end. And we'll have plenty of time for questions, so don't be shy. Before we get started with Nathan and his presentation, I'm going to give a short introduction to the environmental professional programs, what we do here, what these programs are all about, just to provide you some context for what I do and what Nathan and my colleague Megan does. We also welcome questions about the programs specifically, in addition to questions about what Nathan will share. All right, so I am Sarah Graves. I am one of the coordinators for the environmental professional programs at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So what are the environmental professional programs? Well, we have one Master's of Science program in environmental conservation. And three key distinctions about this program, or what makes it unique and an important program at the Nelson Institute, are that it's a professional Master's of Science degree. It provides cohort-based education and interdisciplinary training. So what do we mean by those things? Well, as a professional Master's of Science, it means it has a slightly different timeline. It's accelerated and it's applied. So students in this program complete 32 credits in 15 months. This is in contrast to more of a research program, which is perhaps the same number of credits in 2 to 3 years. And it's specifically for people wanting to advance or change careers. It's professional, right? We want to focus on your professional development and career path. And importantly, it doesn't focus on primary research training. So students don't have to complete a primary research thesis under the supervision of a faculty member or a committee. It's really about focusing on professional application and working with an organization to do conservation work. It's also a cohort-based education model. So all students start together in the summer in June. The size of the program, this says 15 students. It ranges from 15 to 30 students, depending on the program. So it's small and you really do get to know your peers and you take classes together. And that's one of the strongest elements of this program, these programs. And then finally, we really pride ourselves on offering interdisciplinary training. It's one thing that the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies does really well. And we do it particularly well in these programs. So we have technical skills with an application to real world issues, the social aspects, the biological aspects, the political aspects. And with that training, you also get opportunities to grow your network across many disciplines that might touch a topic that's of interest to you. So I'm talking about the Environmental Conservation Master's of Science degree, but within that degree, we have 2 program options. One of the options is in environmental conservation, which is training in navigating complex decision-making, engaging with all people, managing programs, understanding science, and communicating effectively. The other program option is environmental observation and informatics, which is a slightly different focus of general environmental conservation training, but really focusing on remote sensing, GIS, informatics, all to use big data or geospatial data to address environmental issues or questions. And a little bit more about the distinction between these programs. We have this diagram here where you see the EOI focus and the EC focus and how they might differ. So there's a lot of overlap between these programs. But for example, the EOI program is more focused on geospatial technology, image processing, data analysis, whereas the EC program gets more into communication, people skills, community-based conservation, strategic planning. And then there is overlap in professional development, some core environmental conservation, and other aspects of leadership in this field. I said the Professional Masters of Science program was accelerated. Here's the general timeline. It's 15 months. The first 2 semesters are in person in Madison that I'm floating above right now. So we start in June in the summer. The fall semester starts in September, goes through December. So those first 6 or 7 months you're on campus. The following spring, starting in January, all classes are online. We're still here on campus though, so for those who choose to stay in Madison, they can still meet on campus and hang out with their peers and instructors. And then the final summer is a project where you're working with an organization on location at the site. And I'll just highlight that final project for a moment. This is where you're, in the field, even if you're doing computer stuff. And so this final leadership project takes place in that final summer, where for 8 to 12 weeks, you are working with an organization directly. And with all students, we identify a project that connects your passion, your strengths, your professional goals to the organizational needs. So it's a really meaningful project for both the student and the organization. And below are just a few of the organizations that our students have worked with over the past few years. There's plenty more to find out online. So if you want to check out our website, you can do so and learn about more about the projects, more about the timeline. And just if you're thinking about grad schools right now, our applications are open and due December 1st. And then we're thinking about the next cohort starting in June 2022. So that's all I'll share for the overview. I think I didn't see any questions come in. Feel free to ask questions about the program. We can address them at the end. But for now, I will hand it over to Nathan Schulfer, who will talk about priorities for conservation here and abroad. Go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks for the introduction as well to the structure of the program. It's an important aspect of how people engage in their degree, right? Thinking about the structure and the pace. So it's a good way to frame how we even go about thinking about these issues and these emerging trends that we think about a lot here on campus, and then of course within the conservation sector broadly. So give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen with all of you. I'm going to close that participants tab quick and share my screen. Here we go. Oops, now there we are. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen now. So I want to again say thanks to all of you for taking some time out of your day to visit with us here on Zoom. My name is Nathan Schulfer. I'm the Director of International and Professional Masters of Science programs here at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. This is an important year for me in my career, 2021. I first started my career in conservation 25 years ago in 1996, working for the U.S. National Park Service in Glacier National Park. I've also been lucky to work in the political sectors around environmental policy and at both the nonprofit and NGO level before starting here at the Nelson Institute in my position 9 years ago. So when we were imagining putting together this webinar series for the fall semester, we thought it would be helpful to start and just give a really high-level overview of what we know to be trends and priorities that are important right now in the conservation sector. And these trends and priorities, as you'll see, from really what's a quick presentation. So like Sarah said, I'll encourage everyone to ask questions either in the chat or to raise your hand when I'm done. This is an opportunity to share lots of ideas back and forth. And so please, if you do have questions, feel free to ask. But what you're going to see is that lots of things that are happening in conservation are happening here in Madison or wherever your hometown might be. And people are working on many of these same issues around the world as well. So this slide is not an exclusive list of all of the things that are happening in conservation or all of the priorities or all the trends, but they are 4 things that we think are particularly important, that we see lots of the project partners that our students work with. You saw the slide that Sarah shared, whether it's the Nature Conservancy, whether it's the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, whether it's Conservation International, a big NGO based out of DC. We see lots of organizations, both at the nonprofit and NGO level, but then also at the government level, focusing on these issues. In particular, at this moment, we've also seen lots of our students express an interest in being able to learn about and grow professionally in these spaces. So not an exhaustive list, but an important list that shows you some really key areas that the global conservation community is moving forward on quite rapidly these days. So the first trend that I thought I would mention is this idea about natural climate solutions. And for those of you who may not know what that means, when we think about collectively as a society, how are we going to respond to climate change and all of the challenges that come as a result of climate change? The idea of a natural climate solution really is stepping back in time to what we've been trying to accomplish in conservation for many years. Could mean protecting the riverbank at a river that you care about, right? Because flooding is increasing and erosion on the bank is creating damages. So if you can find a way to protect that riverbank, well, that would be considered a natural climate solution. It's a process that's not engineered, that is protecting a landscape, maybe protecting a community. I put forest restoration here because forest restoration is a really hot topic, has been for many years in conservation, but it's certainly the case now. 2021 is the first year of what the United Nations is calling the UN Decade on Restoration. So it's no surprise to you, you all know who are in this webinar, that forests, as an example, store carbon. And we're seeking solutions globally, but also locally, about how we can get more carbon out of the atmosphere as a way to reduce the potential impact of increased temperatures on the planet. One way to do that is to restore degraded landscapes, and forest restoration is a really important strategy that lots of people invest time in an attempt, again, to not only create more forest and the biodiversity that comes with it. If you have more forest, you have more space for animals to thrive. But again, a key aspect of forest restoration is to find ways to sequester more carbon. So beyond forest restoration, right, we know that protecting landscapes is also equally important. So what we're thinking about here is, how do you improve degraded landscapes? How do you go into landscapes that might be overrun by invasive species, as an example? It's not always a horrible thing, right? Some ecosystems have learned to thrive and adapt under changing circumstances. UW-Madison is largely recognized as the intellectual home of forest or landscape restoration. A gentleman named Aldo Leopold many years ago formed the idea about saying, hey, maybe we can play around in these landscapes and try to return them to what would be considered maybe a pre-colonial form. So before human settlement by European colonizers came to the United States. So natural climate solutions. Over the last couple of years, we've had a number of students do their project focused on supporting teams that were thinking about natural climate solutions. You might even read about this in the paper now. The last bullet point that I mentioned here is about the 30-30 pledge. We'll talk a bit more about that in detail. But as people think about how they can conserve and protect more biodiversity at a global scale, forest restoration is one idea, one technique that's really productive and pushes us in that direction of creating more habitat, but again, also as a carbon sequestration tool. Another trend really closely linked to the program that Sarah oversees, but the same is true in the EC program, which Megan Kautzer is the coordinator of, is the use of geospatial technology and data to improve environmental decision-making. So geospatial technology, I think most people think about geographic information systems, so creating maps and using GIS technology to help people understand landscapes and think about landscapes and their features. Mapping is a really helpful tool, right, that helps managers make decisions about how they might invest some money over here, maybe to do that forest restoration project, or maybe understand this part of the land that we're protecting is better for recreation. Maybe it's mountain biking or cross-country skiing as an example. Conservation, like many sectors, is becoming increasingly interested in and reliant upon using technology, geospatial technology, but also data, big data, synthesizing big data to make decisions about how you manage landscapes effectively. Maps tell stories, remote sensing, satellites give us pictures of the land, and we can use that information, again, to be good managers and stewards of the land. One example that we talk about a lot within the geospatial realm with our students in the environmental observation and informatics program is an example of real-time forest monitoring. So there's an organization called Global Forest Watch. They're using satellite data, and you can go to their site, right? And you can pinpoint in a location around the world and get a sense of what's happening at a land use scale. Maybe there's fires on a landscape, and that's helpful as a manager to know that, oh, there's a fire here. Maybe it's natural, or maybe it's unnatural. Maybe it's the result of logging, whatever it might be. Technology and data, what it does for conservation is it allows us to get access to lots of information very quickly, which makes decision-making a bit more efficient. So if you can use a platform like Global Forest Watch, you're managing, just imagine a protected area somewhere around the world. You're at a base, you can't be everywhere at once, but you can look on your computer screen and see what's happening in real time on that landscape. It helps you respond to issues, but again, it helps you be a thoughtful and practical manager of the landscape as well. So geospatial technology and data, not only are they really important right now in conservation, and not only is there a big emphasis on people becoming stronger in using more technology and data to improve their work, this is a space that's only going to continue growing and growing and growing. The reliance, in a good way, in the conservation sector on using these technologies to make us better at our work. A third area that we thought we would highlight, which is important to us personally as a team here in professional programs. It's also important to the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and also important to the conservation sector at a much larger scale, are ideas around justice and inclusion. The environment needs to work for everybody, whether that's clean air, whether that's access to clean water, whether that's access to safe food, whether it's access to recreational sites in urban areas. Making sure people have access to a healthy, safe environment is important. And we can think historically about where we have tripped up over the course of time in ensuring everyone has that access and that right to a clean and healthy landscape. So our institute and our students, but most importantly, our partners in the professional sector, are increasingly placing an emphasis on becoming better, right? They're owning up to past mistakes, being proactive and intentional in trying to find solutions to create a more inclusive space, not just for people to come in and get jobs, but making sure that the outdoors are a welcoming space for lots of people. One area that's particularly important to us here at UW-Madison is how we include more and more Indigenous perspectives about land use, the histories of landscapes, and the ideas that Indigenous perspectives bring to how we manage landscapes moving forward. If any of you by chance had seen in the news about a recent event that happened in France, Marseille, France. It was called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature World Conservation Congress. This is the most singularly large environmental event. It happens every 4 years, and it brings together people from all over the world to talk about these issues that are of most importance in the moment that we live in, for thinking about how we're going to respond to the climate change crisis, how we're going to respond to the biodiversity loss crisis. And one clear recognition, one clear area of growth where people are becoming far more open to think beyond the traditional scientific lens is to bring in Indigenous perspectives about how you manage landscapes. Indigenous communities live on really important critical systems or ecosystems and landscapes around the world. They must be part of the solution. They must be able to bring their ideas to bear on how we as a collective community around the world are working to solve these problems. So Indigenous perspectives are going to become increasingly important, even more so than they are now, into how we make decisions, how we plan for the future, and again, how we create an inclusive environment that has as many voices at the table as we can to help us really think about the complexity of the problems we're trying to solve. Sarah mentioned in her introduction that the Nelson Institute is an interdisciplinary institute. Really what that means is it's a belief that the more perspectives, the more voices you have at the table helps you make decisions that not only are more effective, but decisions that respond to an even larger set of concerns from the communities that we serve. Environmental justice builds on this, right? So as mentioned just a few minutes ago, ensuring that people live in urban areas have access to clean water, making sure that people that live in urban areas have access to food, that they're not living in food deserts. There's an increasing focus and attention being put towards heat islands in cities, right? So if there's not enough green space around where you live, and you live in, say, an industrialized part of town where there's a lot of asphalt or parking lots, right, that increases the temperature of where you live. The world's getting hotter. The impacts of those heat islands are increasingly having detrimental effects on the communities, and in large part, right, communities of color or underrepresented communities that live or have a tendency to be situated in these urban areas where there's less green space. So environmental justice is important to the curriculum, right? It's built into the structure, sort of the guiding philosophy of how we do our work here in professional programs and the Nelson Institute more broadly. But it's an area that people who want to contribute in the conservation sector will continue thinking about and developing and adapting new ideas for how they contribute, in the ways in which they contribute to creating a more equitable space. Both for all people to enjoy nature and to be outside, but again, to make sure some of these structural issues, whether it's access to food, clean water, et cetera, are being addressed in a proactive way. So the final area that I focus on for here, and again, I want to stress, this is not an exhaustive list, and many of you, I hope, will have questions or ideas or things that you want to explore a bit further at the end of this presentation, is that what we're seeing now that's driving many of these trends that I talk about here is a clear recognition, both on the part of governments, but also philanthropic organizations, to create very new ambitious policies that they hope will guide the work of the conservation sector and create the space, essentially, for the conservation sector to succeed at this really critical moment in time to protect more global biodiversity. So one such policy, and I presume many of you have heard about this or read about this, is what's called the 30-30 pledges. These are happening on a global scale. They're also happening here in the United States. And what this means is that by 2030, the goal is that we will have set aside or protected 30% of the Earth's land surface in its original form, its original biodiverse rich form, as a way to A, ensure that there's resources for future generations to enjoy, but also B, for the side benefits, right? Keeping forests intact reduces carbon in the atmosphere, has the potential right then to limit the impacts of global warming. We're also simultaneously in a biodiversity loss crisis, in particular at the species level. That's both floral and faunal species levels. And so the more land you protect, the more habitat that's available for these species to thrive. This gets extended into thinking about corridors, right? Lots of our students are interested in corridors and connectivity. What that means, right, is you see in particular with wildlife species, these subpopulations. I worked in China for a while on giant panda conservation. And the great challenge in China was that you had these different sets, these subpopulations of giant pandas, but they couldn't connect with one another because these corridors, these natural forest corridors were maybe cut off by rivers, so natural barriers, but then also roads and highways. And these subpopulations need to be able to mingle with one another to keep the genetic viability of the species strong over the long haul. So these 30-30 pledges are both designed to protect more landscape, but to also think strategically about how you make sure these landscapes are connected. That in particular really ties back into these first 2 points, right? So forest restoration might be one strategy where you could connect to subpopulations of species or connect to segments of forest that would create more flow of animals back and forth. And then, of course, the use of geospatial technology, remote sensing in specific, to understand these landscapes, to give you a sense for how you can make strategic investments in protecting land, all really tied together. This came to a head last night when I was thinking about this presentation, and I opened up the Washington Post and read 8 new philanthropies made a commitment yesterday to contribute $5 billion to conservation-specific activities that will benefit and help us achieve these 30-30 pledges, right? So 30% land protected by the year 2030. So here's 4 big, broad, overarching priorities. These things happen right here in our backyard, or they happen at global scales. Again, not exhaustive, but 4 areas where there's a lot of funding right now. And so it's driving how people think about how they adapt their work in their approach to trying to stem the challenge, right, that we face again from both the climate crisis and then the biodiversity loss crisis. So that leads to the question, right? How can I contribute? How can we contribute either as an individual or collectively? Of course, there's many, many different ways to have an impact. And although we're not going to talk here about specific project ideas as an example, I think that this is a helpful slide, again, just for all of you who are joining this webinar to start thinking about how am I going to use my graduate education? What are the things that might be helpful to think about as I prepare to make the investment of time and energy into a graduate program? And I want to stress, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the environmental issues that you care about, that we care about collectively, and even the ones I just mentioned on the previous slide, can happen both locally or globally, right? You can do restoration in your own backyard. I've spent the last 2 summers, because we've been in COVID, I've spent so much time at home, I just keep on planting and planting and planting in my backyard. That's already produced really remarkable results in terms of the number of pollinators that are back there and the number of birds that are enjoying my backyard. So personally beneficial, but also having a positive impact. That's just a tiny little chunk of land in the middle of Madison. People are talking about bigger, broader efforts around restoration, and that might be, again, certain places around the world where you're trying to connect corridors or big, large landscapes, even out west here in the United States. So it's helpful, right, to think about where do I think myself as a person, all of you, where do I want to have an impact? And there's no one right or wrong answer. And I think a lot of people find out in their career, they end up moving between both those spaces, but starting to recognize the scale of issues and challenges, where you think your interests lie in that scale. Is it here at home in my community, or is it exploring and participating, contributing to projects around the world? I think a second thing that's helpful to think about when one imagines the different ways that you can contribute is to acknowledge and recognize that there's a lot of different sectors that are thinking about environment and sustainability issues at this point in time. So there's the NGOs and the nonprofits, of course. So, from very big organizations like World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, down to small nonprofits. In our fall conservation planning course, in the environmental conservation program, we're working with 2 very local small organizations. One, the Rock River Coalition, That's just a local, small, regional nonprofit that's having a really big impact on its community. So scale, again, you can work in big organizations, or you can be really in a more grassroots setting on the ground locally. Government agencies, whether it's the US Forest Service, whether it's the US National Park Service, where I started my career, whether it's at the state level, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, or even at a local level, Dane County Parks. There's a lot of people working on very similar issues about how they protect the resources they care about and how they're going to manage those resources into the future. And it's also true that the private sector and even educational institutes are continuing to do more and more to think about issues of sustainability, about their footprint, about their supply chain, if you're a business, where are my products coming from, what kinds of environmental impacts are they having from the point of production, all the way through to when they show up on your front door, right, with your UPS delivery man delivering you your product. So people are thinking about it, and we see more opportunities in the private sector. So helpful, again, just as a way to organize your own thoughts and to prepare for the kinds of things that you know to be interesting and important to you. Take some time, snoop around online and look at all of the different ways and all of the different avenues for contributing in the environmental sector. And then finally, this third point, which really, again, sums up what we believe in at the Nelson Institute, really what we believe in at UW-Madison, even more broadly, but that if you are going to have a career in conservation, we're all impact driven. We want to change the world for the better. That's a hard thing to do. And it requires, again, bringing as many different ideas to bear on the issues that we care about as we can. So to be successful in conservation, we've built the curriculums for both the environmental conservation and the environmental observation and informatics program with this idea in mind. You need a broad understanding of the sciences. You need to understand technology and policy as well. Finally, you need to really be able to understand the social circumstances that are either contributing to the challenge that you're trying to solve or the solution. People matter. We ground our programs in a concept around working with people. It still takes that engagement. It still takes building trust amongst the people that we would consider our constituents or the communities that we're trying to serve. So to succeed in conservation doesn't inherently mean you need to be a scientist or a population biologist. You need to understand the principles that stand behind it. But what really helps you is you have a well-rounded, diverse set of skills. It allows you to think about situations in context, again, lets you understand the influences that might be informing that situation. We certainly believe that in our programs, and we've put effort, a lot of intentional effort and design into creating curriculum that helps people get that experience. So it's such a huge world out there. There's so many things to think about when it comes to climate change, to biodiversity loss. Certainly difficult to wrap that up into a very short presentation, but that's what we've done here. Again, an emphasis on some areas where we know to be priorities and trends and things that are happening in our sector. And then just a little bit of information about how you can start to think about kind of situating where your goals are and the kinds of things that you'd like to accomplish through a graduate degree. So I'm going to end it there, and I'm going to hope that there's questions that I can help answer for you. So what I'll do now is stop sharing my screen. We'll go back to the meeting room, and we'll see if we've got any questions.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. People can feel free to submit questions through the Q&A. I know we got some questions about the program that Megan was answering, but any questions for Nathan about this are welcome as well. Nathan, Megan, and I do have questions for you if we don't get any from participants. So my question, and it's a little bit biased because we work in this space, but we're talking about trends and priorities for conservation in general. And there's more money going into it potentially. Lots of organizations are doing it. What is needed as far as training for how to do this? and I mean, granted, we have this lens for our professional programs, but in a broader picture and conservation projects you've been involved with, China or in Africa, like what are people needing to effectively tackle these conservation issues and use potential money coming in?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one advantage that we have in the United States is we have generally strong civil society structures. So we have a government that functions, generally speaking, on the whole. We have institutions that have been in place for many years. So in developing country context, you have to even take a few steps back and sort of recognize that the challenges you face are different, right? You just don't have systems of rules and regulations that even give you a chance to have a head start. But, so kind of setting that aside, I still think that there are some basic skills. So conservation is a science-driven discipline. So we need some base understanding of science. We don't have to understand every ecological principle, but we need a base understanding of how ecosystems work and the dynamics, because what it does is it allows us, or it gives us a certain authority when we're talking about how we manage or protect or improve a landscape. But there's also a shift, and we've seen this ourselves, even in the organizations that we work with, where they're acknowledging that there's not always a scientific answer for what we're trying to figure out. That's where the people skills come in, and you use the people skills because really what it does, I think, is it allows you to understand the context, the social and political context within what you're working. Then we've got these base skills, right? So, the courses that we have built in these programs where EC and EOI students are together really starts to think about skills that we don't normally associate with conservation, but professional writing, active listening, right? The ability to synthesize and be creative and innovative. So that's slightly different. And then you have to round it off with the skills we've been speaking about. In EOI, you can't do remote sensing unless you really know how to do remote sensing, because you've taken a class, you've thought about the different ways in which you develop a map that's effective, the design elements of these things so people can understand these very complex issues in a clear way, right? There's been a lot of talk that science communication is just critical to how we're going to reach more people and reach decision makers. So you need some of that general education that helps you be practical in the various settings that you're working in. And then you do need to root it, right? And some pretty specific skills. So, we think about grant writing, we think about GIS, we think about conservation planning in the EC space. EOI, they're working with partners from their first summer, Marathon County in this case, learning what is it these folks need and what can I contribute? So that's why, a master's degree ends up being quite essential at this point, because you do need some specific technical skills. It'll be slightly different for each person depending upon what they want, but it starts with science and then you blossom and grow from there, I think.
Yeah, that's good. A good reminder that conservation is rooted in science, but science doesn't get you everywhere. It doesn't solve all the problems. There's other things to consider. Yeah. We haven't had some other questions come in, but I know Megan's been good on the chat about addressing those. So Megan, do you want to either speak about some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A or ask another one?
Yeah, the question that just came in was the exact one I was about to ask as well. They asked about if this is a good fitting program opportunity, either program for non-conservation mid-career people. And so my question was, we do have students from all types of backgrounds that do come to our program. So what are your thoughts on those making a shift mid-career, both in how they figure out where they fit in, being a non-conservation professional, but also how their skill sets might transfer?
Mm-hmm. It is a great question. I would just start by saying, and Sarah and Megan would also recognize this. I mean, we've seen people come into these programs trying to do a career shift, and they've really thrived. And many of them had one thing in common, which was the presumption somehow that because they had not worked in conservation, that they had no skills that translated into this sector. But as they got involved in the degree, they came to recognize, whoa, I actually do have a lot of things that are really helpful. I knew how to manage a budget, and being able to manage a budget on a shoestring conservation project is a critical skill. Maybe they worked in complex situations where they had to bring in feedback from people and they say, wow, yeah, I've worked in some of those spaces where I have to bring together people who might have different opinions and try to find some form of consensus. Because conservation is science driven, it doesn't mean that you, again, need to have that very specific biology undergraduate experience or something to come in and succeed. You may have to work a little bit harder on some of these concepts, in particular, if you want to take a deep dive. Maybe ecological principles as an example. But I think in conservation, many of the things that matter professionally are the same things that matter in a lot of sectors. Am I a good coworker? Can I contribute creative ideas? Can I support and respect the people around me? That's just as important in our work as it is anywhere. And again, we need to be lifelong learners in conservation. Sarah, you have a PhD, and one thing that you and I have spoken about is, well, I have to stay on top of all of these different technologies. Megan, you and me have master's degrees, and we recognize all the time there's these new things that suddenly pop up that we say, well, I guess I knew a little bit about it, but I have to learn more in order to become better and stronger at my work. So in conservation, you are committing to a lifelong learning endeavor. There is no one right or wrong background. I think that makes you succeed, and certainly something the two of you have heard me say a lot, and most all of our students at this point, is that we're trying to solve the exact same issues in conservation we've been trying to solve for a very decades, literally decades at this point. And science hadn't done it on its own. And so it requires new creative people who ask sometimes very simple questions, but in new ways that bring us back to some of the fundamentals and basics. So everyone has a way to contribute in this sector. I mean, career transitions always come with some difficulties and challenges. They can't avoid that piece. But I think most skills and experiences, there is a way to have that be a transferable skill into this space. I mean, you might have to explore around the edges a little bit, but we're not that different. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. We do things that are unique, but we're not that different from how you have to be successful no matter what profession you're involved in. And we love the creativity, right? Like, if it was the three of us talking, we'd say, wow, we really love it when you have a creative group of people that you can imagine bringing together in a learning environment to solve these issues. So something that we seek out in a certain way.
Yeah. Absolutely. Nathan, you hit on everything I was thinking about too. We're not that different. There is absolutely a space to these transferable skill sets that could apply. But really, if we were able to solve these problems, we wouldn't be here with the more narrow, only ecological focused skill sets. So, I mean, just to give some picture, I'd say almost half of our students in the environmental conservation cohort come from backgrounds that are not explicitly environmental science or ecology or conservation biology. I could have a paragraph half page long of, whether it's business and marketing, journalism and communication, dance and musical performance, IT, web design. There's really, I mean, even just a military background as a focused career. So there's been a lot of different non-conservation mid-career professionals. And really, quite honestly, we have an age range of 21 to 56 years old, those students who've been in the program. So it's all ages and levels of experience and types of experience that want to apply their natural abilities and their training to work in conservation, to work that they care about. So yeah, thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, there is one slight distinction I would just mention about the EOI program too, and because of the technology and geospatial focus and the statistics and the data piece, you do need some basis of an understanding in that space because the program is fast-paced. Your first summer, you go into spatial stats, so that's slightly different. But even so, it doesn't mean that there is a sort of narrow, siloed kind of ideal candidate that can succeed in that space. And even though data is tech-driven and that space is tech-driven, it still requires the same focus on ethics, how we make this data available to people, right? Still the things we care about, things that we want to sort of build into our work and professional culture matter just as much in that space. And it's a new frontier, right? It's a kind of keeping rooted to some of those core principles is in some ways even extra important.
Nice. Well, other questions have come in from the Q&A, mostly about the program. One question on choosing the organization that you are going to work with for that final project. The general answer is you don't have to have a organization picked out now. That is something that we explore with you. Megan and myself, I do this with every student. We explore your interests. We see what's out there. We try to make that good match between your interests and what organizations are working on. So it's totally unique to you as a student. It's not something you do have to do on your own. We work with you through that process, whether that's someone we've worked with in the past a lot, like the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, or an organization that's we haven't worked with and you have connections with, or you have an interest in networking with them. So we really are open to lots of organizations, and there really isn't any big distinction between if you're a US or an international student. Another question just on sort of PhD, can graduates of this program go into a PhD program? Megan shared that certainly it's possible. Students have done that in the past. We've had a few graduates go on to PhD programs, both within the Nelson Institute and UW or different universities. But what we find most students do, and what our training is really setting you up for, is to go out and have that career, or have at least a few years actually working in conservation with, you know, a government organization, NGO, even academic work that's not through a PhD program. And really practice what you've learned. And, you know, then if you decide you really want to dive into a PhD, of course, you would have your master's degree as a master's degree training to apply for those PhD programs. And that's definitely something that some students have chosen to do. And then a question just about funding. There's plenty of information about funding on our website, particularly in the Q&A. Funding is important to pay attention to. This going to school is an investment in yourself and your professional development. We have a really strong tuition assistance program. So anyone applies to the program, say apply for tuition assistance to help reduce the cost of the program, but also encouraging you all to look for grants or scholarships that might be particular for your situation, your background, and who you're connected with. Plenty of information though on our website about resources and ideas for how to do that. Anything else, Megan, that I missed for questions?
No, I think just one came in to say, could we talk one-on-one, you know, to learn more about the program? So absolutely. I shared in the Q&A the link to just learning more about professional programs, and our contact information is on there for all three of us. Sarah is the program coordinator for the Environmental Observation and Informatics MS. I am the program coordinator for the Environmental Conservation MS, and Nathan is the director of the professional programs, both of those programs. But Sarah and I would be happy to talk with you individually. It gives us a really good opportunity to explore what would the program look like for you? How would this connect to your future goals? What is your previous experience, and you know, what are you looking for during a graduate program experience? So we'd be happy to schedule a time to talk with you. So please just email us and we'll be able to connect. I figured, Sarah, we could just share what our upcoming webinar is.
Oh, yes,
on October
for sure.
7th.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so as we wrap up, and then Nathan, I can hand it over to you for any final thoughts. In 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from today, October 7th, we will have another webinar here with Megan and myself talking about careers with this degree. So thinking broadly about like what types of jobs EC or EOI graduates go into. We know there's many different jobs, but sort of defining what different paths could look like. and sharing a little bit about what our graduates of these programs have done. Some of the types of work they do, some organizations, the skills that they use. So stay tuned for that. That one will also be recorded, but we encourage you to participate and ask questions. Great. And Nathan, anything else as we close out?
One final thing that I might just offer is these programs are cohort based, and that's a really an added value. It creates a community of people to learn with. And really the strength of that cohort comes from the good and hard work that Megan and Sarah do interacting with students. So it is a unique aspect to the master's programs, right, that we have found to be very beneficial. Giving people a similar kind of training, even though they have a diverse set of interests, and it starts to really spread and sort of pollinate these ideas at a big, wide level. This last summer, we passed the 200-person threshold of people who graduated from these programs. And the cohort model is a really unique and I think positive and productive way of thinking about graduate school, and something that we believe and feel good about as a strength of ours. So it's just an added benefit. And it kind of reinforces the notion that you're not in this alone, kind of trying to find this route forwards. You've got this network of support through our staffing, and then an equally strong network of support through the people that you're learning with, and develops a lot of really important friendships and relationships. And again, I think helps people be more productive in many ways in their time during graduate school. So everyone can always feel free to reach out to me. Megan and Sarah are the great points of contact when you're thinking about applications, but I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today. And there's lots of work to be done solving these very complex issues around the world. So no better time than the present to find ways to figure out how you're going to contribute. That's it for me. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We hope to see you at the next webinar on October 7th.
Bye-bye.